Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Intelligence Studies Project, Clement Center, Strauss Center, the Center for Russian and Eastern European Studies, and the Global Disinformation Lab to an event that we are very excited to have. Needless to say that we have a distinguished guest, and I'll highlight his biography for you. But in times where all eyes are on Russia, we're proud here at UT to say that our focus of research, Russian foreign policy, Russian security, Russian culture, is not something of a fashion, systematic. And because we need a conversation about these issues that are everyone's mind on all the screens that we're looking at, we think that this conversation today with Mr. Vladimir Kara-Murza is not only timely, but it's very important to hear an alternative voice from Russia to talk about all of the things that we're talking about outside of those big academic halls, because they're important, because they have very serious implications. With this, I would like, because our guest today is very well known. However, I would like to highlight a couple of moments from his biography, which make this conversation, I believe, very interesting and important, but also to give an outlet to a dissident voice that gets trampled by the deluge of disinformation and propaganda. So today, Vladimir, who is our guest, we are honored to have a Russian politician, author, and historian, Vladimir Kara-Murza. A long time with the opposition leader Boris Nemtsov, he was a candidate for the Russian parliament and served as deputy leader of the People's Freedom Party. Leading diplomatic efforts on behalf of the opposition, Mr. Kara-Murza played a key role in the adoption of the targeted Magnitsky Sanctions on human rights violators in the United States, EU, Canada, and Great Britain. US Senator John McCain called him one of the most passionate and effective advocates for the passage of the Magnitsky Act. Senator Cardin described him as a courageous advocate for the democratic process and fundamental universal human rights. Twice in 2015 and in 2017, Mr. Kara-Murza was poisoned and left in coma. A subsequent media investigation by Bellingcat and The Insider, their Russian partners, has identified officers of Russian Federal Security Service, FSB, who were behind the poison. Mr. Kara-Murza is contributing writer at Washington Post, hosts a weekly show on Echo Moskvy, or Echo of Moscow radio station, and previously worked for the BBC, RTVI, Kommersant, and other media outlets. He has directed 3 documentary films, They Chose Freedom, Nemtsov, and My Duty Not to Stay Silent, and is the author of Reform or Revolution, The Quest for Responsible Government in the First State Duma, and also is a contributor to several volumes, including Russian Liberalism, Ideas and People, Europe, Whole and Free, Vision and Reality, and Boris Nemtsov and Russian Politics, Powers and Resistance. His biography continues with very high accomplishments, but I would like you to give hand to our guest today, so we can start this conversation. Vladimir, first of all, again, thank you very much for being in person here with us in those times of high tensions here at the University of Texas in Austin. And I'm looking forward to have a conversation on freedom and dissent in contemporary Russia today for our audience for about 40 minutes, where I'm going to walk you, hopefully, walk you through to 4 segments of questions, namely internal Russian politics, something that is on everybody's mind, US-Russia relations, Ukraine, obviously, and then some personal questions related to your political activity and the way dissent has been dealt with in contemporary Russia under Putin. Now, we want to make a very big clarification before we start this conversation, Vladimir, is that when we address Russia and we use shorthand Russia, it has to be understood as Putin's government and not Russian people. It's very important not to play into the propaganda and play into the hands of people who are using every opportunity to explain how we are demonizing it. So Vladimir, my first question would be, how has the nature of Putin's regime changed since his ascent to power in 2000? What is your opinion?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Professor Rama, for a very kind introduction and for having me here as a part of this conversation. Thank you to the University of Texas at Austin, and reciprocate by thanking you for holding this conversation in person, because I think all of us are really, really tired of just staring at a screen all day for a moment. So to see actual people in an actual room, and it's really good to be here. My first time in Austin, my first time at the university. So thank you so much, and thank you also for starting off our conversation by making this distinction between Russia as a nation and the regime of Vladimir Putin, and making the point that those two are not one and the same. It seems kind of like a really obvious point to make, but too many people in the West fail to see or do not want to see that distinction. It's very important for us in Russia when people underscore that difference. You know, it's an old problem that is common to many authoritarian regimes, not just Putin's, when they try to blur the line between themselves and the country they misrule. And it's certainly a long-time problem in Russia. It was back in the 19th century when famous satirical writer, said that too many people in Russia don't see the difference between the motherland and your excellency. By your excellency, I mean how you address higher ups. Отечество ваше превосходительство. And in a much more vulgar and much more primitive way, the same sort of sentiment was echoed by Vyacheslav Volodin, who's the current speaker of the Russian Duma, one of the closest acolytes to Vladimir Putin, who said a few years ago publicly, and I quote, "Нет Putina, нет России." There's no Russia without Putin, and I've never heard anything so insulting ever said about my country. And too many people in the West sometimes sort of fall into this Kremlin propaganda narrative, and we often hear in Western media people talk about Russian behavior, Russian abuses, and Russia this and Russia that. And it's really important for those of us who are also Russian and no less Russian than the people in the Kremlin, when Westerners do underscore this difference and distinction. So thank you so much for doing that. As to your question about the evolution of the nature of the Putin regime, I would hold that there was no evolution. I mean, only if there was any evolution, it was only in the scope and the scale and the intensity of what Putin has been doing, not the intention and not the nature itself. For many years, of course, Mr. Putin has been there now for 22 years and counting. We have a whole generation of people in Russia who have grown up not knowing and never knowing any other political reality. We have people in Russia who were born, went to kindergarten, went to school, went to college, are now beginning to enter their adult professional lives, and all this time, one man has stayed in power. It's mind-boggling. We in America have had 5 presidents of 2 different political parties at the same time that we'll just have this one dictator. And so for many initial years of Putin's rule, many people in the West, either through naivete or because they wanted to sort of be fooled, there's that component as well, sort of pretending they didn't know just who Mr. Putin was. Remember that famous question of Davos World Economic Forum, who is Mr. Putin? Asked him in 2000, I think this was. And when there was a silence, there was a panel of Russian experts, including then Deputy Prime Minister Mikhail Kasyanov. This question was asked, and none of the experts responded, and then the room just burst out in laughter. I can tell you precisely, this might sound weird, but you'll understand why it's so precise. I can tell you precisely when I realized who Vladimir Putin was and just what direction he was going to take our country. And there's nothing to boast about here, because many of my friends and colleagues have understood it much earlier. But for me, this was December the 20th, 1999. Mr. Putin was still prime minister, still 11 days before President Yeltsin's resignation, before he would take over the Kremlin. This is, of course, December 20th is the so-called Chekist Day, the day that has been marked, and astonishingly still officially marked in Russia, to celebrate the founding of the Cheka, Soviet secret police, in December of 1917 by the Bolsheviks. And on that day, Mr. Putin, of course, himself a lifelong Chekist and KGB officer, went to Lubyanka Square in Moscow, the headquarters of the KGB, now the FSB, to officially unveil a memorial plaque to Yuri Andropov. Now, Yuri Andropov, as many of you know, was somebody who really epitomized the worst of the worst of the post-Stalin repression in the Soviet Union, both the domestic repression and the external aggressiveness. He was one of the people who was coordinating the invasion of Hungary in 1956. As long-time head of the KGB, he set up a special directorate, the fifth special directorate to target political dissenters, those people who opposed the Soviet regime, instituted and expanded a horrendous practice of punitive psychiatry for people who were opposed to the communist system or declared mentally insane and kept in torturous conditions in psychiatric hospitals, and so on and so forth. So somebody who really symbolized both the domestic repression and the external aggression side of the Soviet system. Now, if you unveil a memorial plaque to that guy, you're sending a pretty clear signal of just what your intentions are and what your plans are. And if anybody still had doubts, within the first year of his presidency, in the year 2000, Vladimir Putin reinstated the music of the Stalin-Era Soviet national anthem as the national anthem of the Russian Federation. If you were to choose a symbol for what we were going to do, nothing could be better or more precise than this. Russia is a country of symbols, as I don't need to tell you. So the answer to your question, the Putin regime himself has been the same from the very beginning. It took some time because, you know, what Vladimir Putin inherited in 2000 was a more or less functioning democratic system in Russia. We had a real parliament with a real opposition. We had independent media. We had checks and balances in the system. It takes time to dismantle all that. It doesn't happen in a day. And it took him maybe about 3 years, I would say. The year 2003 was in many ways a turning point. It was the year when Putin shut down the last independent TV station. It was the year when he imprisoned his most high-profile political rival, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. And it was a year when we had a parliamentary election that resulted in no genuine opposition returning to parliament. This was the first election in post-Soviet Russia to be assessed as not fair by international observers. So this was in many ways a turning point. And everything we have seen since then is just a continuation of the same, more in scale, more in intensity, but I would argue exactly the same in the essence that we have seen from the very beginning.
Well, thank you for addressing this. And just to follow up on that, you're saying we're seeing some sort of a, you know, constant, never-changing essence, you know, which has manifested in different ways that, you know, external analysts and Russia watchers are observing the signs. But are we having the same confident Putin and the same stability of the regime if you're looking for this progression of time? Or we're seeing something else completely?
There's less and less stability and less confidence. And we can certainly see this in the regime's actions. We're certainly seeing this in the fact that the regime is becoming more and more paranoid as the years go by. Initially, and you know, it gives me no pleasure to say this, I was in opposition to Putin from the first moment, but I'm just, you know, speaking here honestly, I have to say that for the initial years, he did have some genuine popular support in Russian society. And a lot of people in Russian society, not everyone, but a lot of people sort of took this informal social contract, as the phrase goes, to basically give up political rights and freedoms, democratic rights and freedoms, in exchange for economic growth, which was real for the first years of Putin's rule. It was almost nothing to do with him. It was due to the fact that oil prices skyrocketed. You know, when in the last years of Boris Yeltsin's presidency, oil prices were about $10 to $15 a barrel. In 1998, when we had the financial crisis, they were $9 a barrel. Under Putin, they skyrocketed up to 150. It's not difficult to deliver economic growth. Of course, the energy resources being the main driver of the Russian budget revenues. But so for the initial years, there was this unspoken social contract. So for years, the regime was able to survive with a combination of the carrot, being economic growth, and the sticks that we already referred to, you know, shutting down the independent media, going after political opponents, rigging elections. There was sort of a balance on that. As the years went by, as economic growth declined, and we basically had economic stagnation for more than a decade now, the last year of real economic growth in Russia was 2008, and for several years now, the real life incomes have been falling and falling. And also don't discount the growing fatigue that people have been seeing the same face on their television screens in many cases for their entire lives, right? For their entire lives for some people, and for those, you know, who are fortunate enough as I am to remember what it was like before Putin, but still, it's a sizable chunk. It's what's most of my life as well. And there's this growing level of restlessness and fatigue, and this growing sentiment that some change needs to come to the country. And there was a Levada Center poll a couple of years ago, the Levada Center being the last more or less independent reliable polling agency in Russia, that showed that nearly 2/3, 62% of Russians calling for comprehensive change in the country. That's a high percentage. And so as this has been sort of proceeding this way, and as the carrots have been decreasing, the regime has been relying increasingly more and more on repression. And repression, not just in the sense that, yes, sticks, and now it's almost all the sticks. And it's no longer just about muzzling the media. It's no longer just about rigging elections. It is now about large-scale political repression. We have hundreds of recognized political prisoners in Russia, people who are incarcerated not because they've broken any laws, but because they've crossed certain political or religious lines, red lines imposed by the Putin system. We have, you could get several years in prison just for attending a peaceful opposition rally, as we've seen from the Bolotny protests, but also more recently the Moscow protests in 2019, and of course last year's nationwide protests after the arrest of Alexei Navalny. And we are seeing state-sponsored assassinations and assassination attempts. We are coming up to the 7th anniversary of the most high-profile, the most brazen political assassination in the modern history of Russia, when Boris Nemtsov, former deputy prime minister and the most prominent political opponent to Mr. Putin, was gunned down literally in front of the Kremlin wall in Moscow, February 27, 2015. And since then, we have seen a whole slate of state-sponsored poisoning attacks. We mentioned this in my introduction. I was the subject of this on 2 occasions. Alexei Navalny was the subject of this, of course, as everybody knows. Dmitry Bykov, a Russian satirical writer, several regional opposition activists, and so on and so forth. So the level of repression under Putin's system today has risen beyond the sort of quote-unquote traditional political repression, and now includes state-sponsored murders and assassinations. This is not
a state-craft instrument.
Absolutely, and this is. And by the way, we sort of, especially those of us who live in Russia, we're so used to this reality that sometimes it's just worth making a step back and just saying this out loud, that in the 21st century, in a European country, there is a state-employed squad of professional assassins whose job it is to go around and poison political opponents of the government with prohibited chemical weapons. And so, of course, none of this, apart from being criminal, none of this is a sign of confidence or strength. The regime is increasingly scared, the regime is increasingly insecure, the regime is increasingly paranoid, all the more so as we approach the crucial date of 2024, which is supposed to be the end of Putin's rule, according to the term limits, which he tried to overturn in a series of unlawful and illegitimate constitutional amendments, which is now leading to a whole area of debate both internationally and within Russian society.
Thank you for kind of addressing some of the the directions that I was thinking about walking through. But one question, I'll play devil's advocate, Vladimir. What do recent election results in 2021 tell us about the state of internal politics in Russia and the strength of the opposition?
I'm impressed you were able to keep a straight face when asking that question. One of the sort of features of the Putin system is that a lot of the old Soviet jokes have been coming back because the realities are so strikingly similar. One of the jokes that has really sort of regained its fashion today was the one, I think this is from the late 1970s, about Communist Party official coming to work in the morning and seeing, the first secretary, his boss, running around the office, tearing his hair out in a state of panic. And the official says, Comrade First Secretary, what's going on? And he said, somebody broke into the safe overnight and stole all the official election tallies. And he said, well, Comrade First Secretary, don't worry about it. They've all been published in the newspapers. He said, you don't understand. They stole the tallies for the next election. And this is unfortunately, again, the reality of life. We have no elections in Russia. We haven't had any elections in Russia for 2 decades. And you don't have to take my word for it. Just go and read the reports from the observer missions from the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or the Council of Europe, sort of the main watchdogs in terms of election observation. The last time these organizations and their monitors have assessed a Russian national election to have been more or less free, fair, and democratic was back in 1999-2000. So again, just before, or just at the time when Putin was coming to power. Not a single one since then. So of course we have no elections, and you know the main opponents of the regime are not even allowed to participate. For example, anybody even remotely associated with Alexei Navalny and his organization, which is of course the main political challenges of the Putin
His
system.
trial is coming very soon.
Another one, right? Another one. He's already in prison, but they want to add another 15 years to his sentence. That's coming up, yes, literally in the next few days. And so anybody associated with Navalny and his movement has been declared a quote unquote an extremist. So, you know, we have the Taliban coming to Moscow and shaking Sergei Lavrov's hand, you know, people who are beheading women athletes in Afghanistan. Apparently that's not a problem for the Kremlin. But if you're calling for an end to government corruption with free elections, then you're an extremist. Again, that's a Kafkaesque reality of the Putin system that we're living in. And so, you know, it's not much of an election when your opponents are not allowed to be on the ballot. I think we could probably end the conversation there, but it actually doesn't end there, because even when real opponents are not on the ballot, very often people find creative ways of sending a message still, and find, you know, some random technical spoilers on the ballot and vote for them just in order to send a message that they're fed up with the system and its candidates. This happened in a most spectacular way in 2019 during the Moscow City Council elections, when, of course, most of the real genuine opponents were removed from the ballot ahead of time. But then came the election, and nearly half of the districts for the Moscow City Council, 20 out of 45 to be precise, pro-regime candidates lost literally to nobodies, just some technical random spoilers who happened to be on the ballot, just to send a message. But such is the growing fatigue with the Putin system that people are prepared to vote for anybody or anything, you know, this table against the candidate for United Russia. My favorite story from the 2019 election was from northwest of Moscow, a district called Shukina, where a good friend of mine, my colleague in the opposition, Alexander Solovyov, was planning to run for a seat in Moscow City Council. He was disqualified from the ballot. He was actually put in jail, where he spent the duration of the campaign. But while he was still running, they put up a spoiler. The authorities put up a spoiler with the same name. You know, classic tactics sometimes used in Western countries. Same name, Alexander Solovyov. And I guess they just forgot to take him off the ballot when they jailed the real one, because nobody even knew about his existence. I mean, the guy never appeared in the district, never held a single meeting, never spent a single cent in campaigning, never published a single leaflet, nothing, zero. And then a week before the vote, Navalny and his organization called on people to vote tactically for these random nobodies, just to send a message to the Kremlin. And this guy won in a landslide. And the Electoral Commission spent 2 days after the vote trying to find this guy's phone number, because nobody knew what he looked like and who he was, to tell him that he's now an elected member of the Moscow City Council and has to show up for work. It's a ridiculous story, but there's a serious point behind it. That such is the rising level of not so much protest, but just fatigue with the system that people are prepared to show in creative ways. So to go back to this so-called parliamentary election we had in September, there's now an added layer on top of all of this that the authorities use to ensure the quote-unquote correct result, which is the so-called electronic voting system. Now, this is a system that is used in democracies around the world, most prominently in Estonia, in which basically all elections for years now have been almost exclusively electronic. And I had a conversation with the Estonian ambassador in Moscow soon after our election in September. And I asked him, how long does it take for the Estonian authorities to tabulate the electronic election results? And he sort of didn't understand the question. He said, what do you mean, how long does it take? 10 seconds, you press a button and it's set because it's already tabulated. And I asked him, well, how about 17 hours? Because that's what it took in Russia. Because they first counted the paper ballots. And for example, in Moscow, in 8 out of 12 districts, the opposition candidates were winning, those who were allowed to run, right? Most of them were not, but those who were winning in 8 out of 12 districts against the pro-regime candidates. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, appeared those phantom so-called electronic votes, and of course, completely switched the results in all of those districts. So that's a new know-how for the regime. And why do you need to bother with traditional techniques such as, you know, bussing people around or ballot stuffing or rewriting tallies, all of which you could get caught for doing when you can just make up phantom votes? It's sort of a new technological know-how for these dictatorships.
This is a novelty from the political technology.
Right.
Vladimir, last question in this segment that I would like to address, and again, it's going to be provocative. It is, would you like to describe for our audience the profile of the contemporary dissent outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, and to make a comparison? Because there is this
Right.
argument, right? You're probably familiar and confronted with it. That you do have the large urban, big city intelligentsia. You have the very specific profile of dissent there, and outside of Moscow, it's completely different reality.
Right. And this has been, I want to say stereotype, but actually there's a lot of truth behind it. I mean, as you know, knowing Russian history well, all major political changes have come from the capital cities. Moscow, St. Petersburg, or both, depending right, on the time period. And of course, it still remains true that nothing really could happen without the participation of the capital cities. But I would say the major change from the past is that you now see almost the reverse situation to the one you were sort of suggesting in the question, and that is that very often now out in the regions, the protest sentiments are much higher than they are even in the capital cities. I mean, they're high enough in the capitals. I refer to the Moscow election, so-called in 2019. But outside, I mean, everybody saw what happened in Kara-Murza, in the Russian Far East, through the summer of 2020. There were these pockets of protests breaking out all over the place. And also these sort of local election victories for the opposition in the rare cases where the opposition was allowed on the ballot. For example, the Vladimir movement scored impressive victories in Siberia, Tomsk and Novosibirsk in 2020, also in the local municipal elections. But most importantly, and I can speak firsthand from personal experience, and I often travel around the country. I'm a Muscovite myself. I live in Moscow, but I travel around Russia and meet people in the regions and try to hold events as much as we can. Publicly, and certainly just meeting and speaking with people. And first of all, I do find, even from personal experience that in personal interactions, that this level of restlessness and fatigue that we do see also in capital cities is exponentially higher out of the regions. When I say the regions, of course, I still mean big cities, because Russia is a very urbanized country. 70% of our population live in big urban settlements. So we're not talking about rural areas, just to make clear. We're still talking about big cities, but far away from Moscow and St. Petersburg.
Outside,
and outside of the European part of Russia as well. So Siberia, Far East, beyond the Ural Mountains. And what I also find, and this to me is really important, and really striking, we touched on this in your class on propaganda yesterday, the sort of this generational difference, a generational shift. Back in the day, this was sort of accepted sort of tradition that there were different audiences if you were speaking to people in the capital cities like Moscow, Leningrad, Moscow, Petersburg, or when you were speaking to an audience in what some of us Muscovites snobbishly call the provinces, right? You would just be able to tell the difference by the way people speak, by the question we ask, by the topics there, and so on. And that is still the case among the older generation. That is still, you can still sort of feel that difference. That is no longer true of the generation that lives, I don't know what I thought of it, that lives in the gadgets, that sort of lives in this new information space on social media, that don't watch Putin television, that is the subject of your seminar. And I was in Syktyvkar not long ago, which is in the Republic of Komi, in the eastern part of the European part of Russia, just west of the Ural Mountains, one of the former capitals of the Gulag. Pretty big city. And we had a film screening and then a discussion, just sitting and speaking with people. And there were several students, young people in the audience. And I was sort of speaking with them and answering questions and talking, discussing things. And I caught myself thinking that I can no longer tell the difference, whether I'm speaking to somebody in Syktyvkar or in Moscow, or for that matter in Budapest, Prague, or Berlin. Because that generation, let's say 30 and below, they live in a totally different information space. It's not that they don't trust Putin state television, they just don't watch it. They live on YouTube, they live on Facebook, they live on Twitter. They use the same social media platforms that the people in this country and in other Western countries use. And so the mentality of that generation, to me, is the biggest hope of the coming change in Russia. Because, as Alexei Navalny said a couple of years ago, he was on Moscow radio, and he was asked, I guess what the anchor thought was a provocative question. He said, could you outline the program of the opposition? I mean, what do you propose? What do you want? What are you going to do when you come to power? And I suppose maybe the journalist was expecting a long and drawn out list of policy proposals or whatever. And Alexei answered, with one short and simple phrase. He said, we want Russia to be a normal European country, full stop. And to anyone who knows Russian history, there's so many in that one small phrase.
It's very loaded.
And so there are millions of people in Russia who share that goal and who do want Russia to become a normal European country. And to me, this is the biggest source of hope and optimism for the future.
Thank you very much, Vladimir, for taking on this rather hard question. I really hope to see this situation that you're describing to be turning into reality, where the battle between the TV and the fridge,
Right.
and you've introduced another one, is having a sort of different dynamics, because as you know, we're saying there's a common saying in Eastern Europe and in Russia, right? The battle between the propaganda TV and the fridge, the necessity. You still had those years when the TV was winning over the fridge. Now probably the tide is turning. Let's switch gears now and try to connect, look beyond the internal politics of Russia, contemporary Russian politics today. And I would like to provoke you with another question by asking, what should be the American posture towards Russia under Putin?
And of course, as we shift from domestic policy to foreign policy, that's always bear in mind that those are two sides of the same coin. When it comes to Russia, certainly modern history of Russia, the domestic and the foreign are a reflection of each other in both good and bad sense. So in a good sense, we saw this 3 decades ago when Russia was, sort of striving towards democracy internally, and we saw that reflected in much more friendly modern foreign policy. And when we see periods of domestic repression, that is always reflected also in the external aggressiveness. And those two things go together, because why would a regime that tramples on the rights of its own people and violates its own laws be respectful of international laws or the interests of other countries? It's not going to, and it is. So that's just sort of a small caveat to what you're saying. As for the American posture, for that matter, the posture of the free world in general, one of the most popular leitmotifs of the Kremlin propaganda machine, which you know well as being the subject of your study in the seminar here at this university, is that these state TV channels, and propaganda in general, like to accuse people like myself and my colleagues in the Russian opposition of somehow wanting the West to intervene into Russian domestic affairs. It's like the interference in domestic affairs. Yeah, meddle, exactly. So these coined phrases that they use. Somehow we want someone we come to the West and we ask the West for money or for political support, or we ask them to come in and enact regime change in Russia, whatever other nonsense these propaganda channels, which unfortunately you have to watch for your work, which I really feel sorry for you about what they keep saying. Of course, as I don't need to tell you, none of that has anything to do with reality. Only Russians in Russia can change the political direction of Russia. It's really obvious, but it's just worth stating. That's just the only way it can and the only way it should happen. The only thing we do actually want to see from the free world, from the democracies of the world, certainly above all from the United States of America, is that democratic countries actually stand on the values that they say they are committed to. They actually practice what they preach. And that those countries that are committed domestically and that are rightfully proud of their adherence to such notions as the rule of law, democracy, respect for human rights, but those countries do not enable the corruption, the kleptocracy, and the human rights abuses committed by the Putin regime in Russia, for that matter, by other autocracies around the world, because this, unfortunately, is exactly the model we have seen for so many years. One of the defining features of the Putin system, alongside the repression and the aggressiveness and everything that we've already discussed, one other defining feature of the system is its astonishing hypocrisy. Because what you have is you have this small circle of people around Putin who on a daily basis attack and abuse and undermine the most basic norms of democracy and rule of law in our country, in Russia, but then like to come to the West and enjoy the benefits and the privileges of the very notions of democracy and rule of law that they deny their own people. And of course, the way they do this is they've long made a habit, these people, the closest circle around Putin, They've long made a habit of stealing in Russia and then spending and stashing away that money in the West, where that money is going to be protected by the very rule of law that they're denying our people.
The loss in slums as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Well, actually, from the National Bureau of Economic Research, the estimate is about $1 trillion with a T, US dollars of private Russian assets stashed outside of Russia. Much of that money likely linked to Putin himself, as we've seen in small glimpses such as the Panama Papers and the Pandora Papers, and so on. And so this, of course, is an astonishing hypocrisy on the part of the people who do this. But frankly speaking, this is also enabling, and this is also complicit on the part of those Western countries that allow this to happen. Because, you know, it's been said, and I fully share the sentiment, that the largest export from the Putin regime to the West is not oil or gas, it is corruption. And I think that statement is absolutely true, except, of course, that is a two-way street. And for somebody to be able to export corruption, someone else somewhere needs to be willing to import it. And we have seen no shortage, unfortunately, of Western banks, Western governments, Western financial institutions, and so on, of being willing to look the other way, or even worse, to actively accept this dirty money with open arms. And so, to answer your question in a very short way, we want this complicity and this enabling to stop. And this is why I have been involved for many years now in international advocacy for targeted personal sanctions, not sanctions against Russia as a country, I would never advocate for that, targeted personal sanctions against those individuals in Putin's close circle, the kleptocrats, the oligarchs, the Kremlin wallets, as we call them, who've made a habit of doing this, of stealing in Russia and spending that money in the West, to take away their ability to receive visas or assets or use the financial and banking system of Western countries. These are called the Magnitsky Sanctions, which you referred to in the introduction to our conversation. I'm proud to say that as of today, nearly every major Western jurisdiction has such legislative mechanisms on the books already, beginning with the United States. It was the first country that adopted this 10 years ago in 2012. Also the United Kingdom, which for reasons I don't need to explain is a particularly important country in this regard. The entirety of the European Union, some individual EU member states, Canada, as of December, literally just before the new year, Australia joined this growing chorus of accountability. And so what we want to see the democracies of the world do, to answer your question, is to actually use those mechanisms to the extent that they were intended, and to really do stop this enabling and this complicity, whereby, in effect, the West is helping to oil the wheels of the Putin system that allows it to continue the abuses and corruption that have become its hallmarks for so many years now.
Thank you for addressing this, but I'm not going to spare you the next one. A lot of people are accusing you, your colleagues, including opposition leaders such as Navalny, that you advocate for sanctions that actually hurt Russia. And the next sub question to that always is like, do sanctions actually work? What's your take on that?
So of course, there's so many other things spread by the Putin propaganda that is a patent lie. And in fact, it's really outrageous in terms of the fact that it's actually the exact opposite of the reality in this sense. Again, as many things that are spread by Putin's propaganda are. Back in the day, in previous historical eras, in previous generations, sanctions would indeed target entire countries and entire populations. And so, if the US or other Western democracy was unhappy about the behavior of some autocrat or some dictator, they would slap general sanctions on the whole country and on the whole population. In effect, double punishing that population that's already suffering under that dictatorship, but it also gets slapped on top of that with sanctions from the Western world. And to me, that's a fundamentally unfair principle, obviously. But apart from being unfair, it's also really ineffective because it gives that regime a very easy excuse to explain away the economic problems that their people are suffering from, just shift the blame, exactly. So the problems that are actually caused by the bad policies, the corruption, the mismanagement by these regimes, now it's so easily explained, oh, look, it's those Americans and putting sanctions on us, that's the source of all the problems. And so, in my view, general sanctions are both unjust and ineffective. The Magnitsky sanctions, the targeted sanctions, are the exact opposite. The brilliance of this notion is that for the first time, when this legislative mechanism appeared now, a decade ago, it introduced the notion of individual responsibility. So instead of punishing, in our case, 140 million Russians for the actions of a small unelected clique in the Kremlin, you're actually going after them personally. You're actually going after the people who deserve to be targeted, and you're doing it in the most effective way imaginable. Because all these people care about is being able to steal from Russia and then to stash away and use that stolen money in the West, where they have all their bank accounts, their villas, their yachts, their wives, their mistresses, whatever, all their lives. This is their raison d'etre. And when you cut their access to that, this is the most effective thing you could do.
Sends the signal.
Right. And so, in a very symbolic way, when the Magnitsky Act was passed, and Boris Nemtsov played an absolutely key fundamental role in convincing the American Congress to pass this law, over opposition from the Obama administration that had a reset going with Putin, as you remember. Boris Nemtsov would maybe meet with members of Congress on both sides of the hill, both sides of the aisle, argue, he would explain. Senator John McCain, who was a co-author of the American Magnitsky Act, said publicly on the record there would not have been a Magnitsky Act in America without Boris Nemtsov. That is an astonishing statement from an American senator. But he's absolutely right. That is exactly the case. And so when this law was passed, it replaced the same piece of legislation, repealed the so-called Jackson-Vanik Amendment. That was a sort of Cold War era holdover from the 1970s, putting general trade sanctions on the Soviet Union, later transferred to Russia. That was repealed. And instead, Congress passed the Magnitsky Act that put up these targeted sanctions against these oligarchs and human rights abusers, and so on. And Boris Nemtsov called the Magnitsky Act, and I always often repeat this phrase, he called it the most pro-Russian law ever passed in a foreign country, because it targets the people who abuse the rights of Russian citizens and who steal the money of Russian taxpayers. So there's nothing anti-Russian about this. It's pro-Russian. It's the most pro-Russian thing you can think of. And as to the second part of your question, how effective this has been, as I said, this is the most effective thing that there can be, but only if it's used. Again, an obvious point, but worth making, because it's not enough just to have that legislation on the books, right? It's a legislative branch that puts this legislation, but of course it is the executive that has to implement it. And we have seen, not just in the US, but in other Western countries where this law, where these laws have been passed, we have seen the executive branch, for one reason or another, being really hesitant and really timid in enforcing this legislation. To give you just one example that's closest to home here, in now more than a year that the current US administration has been in place, there hasn't been a single one, zero designations against any of the Kremlin officials under the Magnitsky Act in the United States. And this is the case in other Western countries too, it's not just the US. And so the reason these sanctions have not been effective is because they haven't been used. Obviously, if you don't do something, that's not going to be effective. And you know, a year ago when Alexei Navalny was arrested in Warner, January 2021, his team released a list of a few dozen sort of key officials and oligarchs around Putin who should be targeted by these Western sanctions. As of today, most of the people on that list are still freely able to roam on both sides of the Atlantic. And to my mind, that is an outrageous situation.
Well, thank you on that. You know, later on, I'll give you the chance to explain, you know, how you can fit out of the category of the fifth column, you know, because I know how you've been dumped, you know, constantly by the propaganda narratives. But now I'd like to yet again switch gears and talk about one of the most important and hot topics, obviously, and it's Ukraine. So I want to hear what's your take on Ukraine, and to hear your opinion is if we're dealing with a classic example of coercive diplomacy and psychological warfare, or we're looking at a real prospect of invasion, which is moving.
So again, going back to that theme, that external aggression is the flip point side of domestic repression. Nowhere has this been more prominent and more clear than in the case of Ukraine. Everything that Putin has been doing to Ukraine and with Ukraine since the victory of the Euromaidan revolution in February 2014 has been motivated exclusively, not primarily, but exclusively domestic reasons. On Putin's watch, there have been many, as the Kremlin terms of color revolutions, so democratic, pro-democracy, peaceful public uprisings against authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes that took place in a whole host of post-Soviet and post-communist countries, starting with Serbia, Georgia, Armenia, Moldova, and others. But nowhere was as close to home and as dangerous for Putin than Ukraine. Because, you know, it's one thing when a country, let's say one of the Baltic states, one of the Central European countries, establishes a successful democratic system. That's obviously bad from the point of view of people like Putin, but it's not an immediate and existential threat. But when we're talking about Ukraine, a country with so many family, linguistic, historical, cultural, religious, you name it, links with Russia, a country that is still today largely Russian speaking. If you're talking about a country like this that engages in a successful democratic experiment, that is an existential threat to regimes like Putin's, because of course he realizes full well that he will be next. And it's only a question of time before people in Russia start asking the obvious question, you know, why can they freely choose their own leaders and we have to be stuck with the same guy for a quarter of a century? And so everything he's been doing to Ukraine, to my mind, has been motivated by a desire to prevent the success of the Ukrainian democratic experiment. So what we're seeing today is a continuation of that. As to your question whether it's just psychological warfare or real warfare, if you asked me this before the new year, I would say it's probably the former. It's just a plot to grab attention, to get, you know, Western leaders to come and meet with him, which is, by the way, he successfully accomplished, as we see. There's not a week goes by now without a major Western leader coming to Moscow. Because, of course, this also happened, as you remember, last spring, you know, when the troops were amassed and then withdrew, and then the Geneva summit between Biden and Putin was sort of largely as a result of that. So this is what I would have said if we were here 2 months ago. But I have to say it looks more and more worrying in practical terms now, because this accumulation of troops continues. It's now not just on the Russian-Ukrainian border, but also on the Belarus-Ukrainian border, so potentially opening a northern dimension to this. And also, a couple of weeks ago, the Communist Party in the Russian so-called parliament, which is, you know, again, the so-called parliamentary opposition, obviously they don't have real opposition, but they play that role. They introduced a draft resolution on the official recognition of the so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, which, if I'm correct, is going to be considered next week. If you go back to the war with Georgia in 2008, it was sort of the same model. The Duma passed a resolution recognizing the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, so-called independence. And this is actually a classic sort of technological manipulative tactic by the Kremlin to try to do something through somebody else's hands. They can always say, oh, we didn't introduce this resolution. It was the parliamentary opposition protocol. We have to consider it. And so
I think, in essence, what you're saying, it's a pattern that we're seeing. You know, that
I think frankly, it's getting more and more worrisome with every single day. Let's watch that that resolution next week. I think that's going to answer a lot of the questions you asked.
Thank you about that. How should Ukraine respond?
Well, conversely to what I was just saying, I think the best answer to this would be the success of building of a functioning and stable democratic system in Ukraine. It's certainly not for me to sort of comment on that or criticize them. Suffice it to say, I mean, it hasn't really happened so far. Right? Obviously, there's a lot of external pressures, to put it very mildly, mostly from Putin himself. But also, you know, I have many friends in Ukraine, including in the political sphere, including in the parliament, and many of them have, you know, have not been too happy about the way the domestic politics have been going. But I think this would be the most effective response. If Putin's goal is to try to prevent Ukraine from becoming a successful democracy, then your best response to that is actually try to become one as quickly as you can.
Thank you for that. I have two last questions before we open for our audience, and one of them is, of course, disinformation being the fashion and the focus of attention of what we do in the Intelligence Studies Project and the Global Disinformation Lab. How do we compare the disinformation environments in Russia and the US? Do you find similarities, differences?
I guess you could find similarities in everything, but the one big sort of contrast I would draw is that, you know, even if you say that there are sort of sources of disinformation in the US, and of course I'm sure there are, but the point is you have different sources of information. You know, if you're an American, you can take your remote control and switch between Fox and MSNBC and whatever else, and you have all sorts of, you know, a multitude of news and information sources and opinion sources to listen to, and at the end of the day, you know, people make their informed decisions normally after hearing from several sources, and that is, of course, that is completely lacking in Russia. The first thing that Putin made sure of is that he had a total monopoly, his regime had a total monopoly on the information sphere. In the first 3 years of his rule, he has destroyed, either by shutting down or by taking over, every single independent, privately owned, nationwide television network in Russia. When he came to power, we had a pluralistic television scene, much as we have here in the US, with different points of view and different television channels. This was all destroyed within the first 3 years of his rule. By the year 2003, that was the last, June 2003 was the last independent TV channel was switched off by the order of Putin's press minister. And today, even despite the social media and the internet and so on, television, traditional terrestrial television, remains the primary source of information for the majority of Russian citizens. And so disinformation has a monopoly, and this is the difference. So as you know, having unfortunately to watch Russian state television as part of your work, if all you watch is Russian state television, people like Dmitry Kiselyov and Evgeny Popov and all these other crazies. First of all, I'm sorry about the mental health of people who have to watch this, but other than that, in practical terms, as you know well, having to do this for as part of your job, you live in this imaginary, made-up
unreality of Pomerantsev.
Right, exactly. This fake world where where Ukraine is a puppet American state run by Nazis, where the United States of America has no other goal in life except to destroy, dismantle, and dismember Russia, where everybody who opposes, every Russian who opposes Vladimir Putin's regime is an agent of Western intelligence agencies in a fifth column, as you put it, to use a term from the Spanish Civil War, and so on. Well, Ukrainian soldiers crucified Russian children, literally. You remember the story from Stalin-Era, right? And so this is sort of the psychological warfare that millions of Russians are subjected to, and you have no alternative, because however many times you flip that remote control, all you will see is more and more and more Putin state television channels. And so this is the big difference. So if you do have sources of disinformation here, you are able to take that remote and switch it off. In Russia, people don't. There's this vivid story to me that this is probably the shortest way I've heard to summarize the contrast between President Yeltsin, the previous Russian president, and Putin. Boris Nemtsov liked to tell a story how when he was deputy prime minister, once having a meeting with President Yeltsin in the Kremlin, in his office, and NTV was on. There was a television set, and NTV was on. NTV, of course, was the biggest independent, privately owned channel in Russia. And they had another one of those satirical shows with biting, harsh criticism of Yeltsin and his government. And one of those shows came on. And Boris Nemtsov remembered how Yeltsin asked him to pass the remote control and just switched off his TV set. He said, I'm tired of hearing this conspiracy, let's just switch this off. So of course, for Putin, it wasn't enough to switch his own TV set, he had to switch everyone else's as well. And so when he came to power, he just destroyed the television channels themselves. So I think this is the big fundamental difference.
Thank you for addressing this. My last one would be personal, and it's not an easy one, but it's something that is quite important. It's part of also one of our research projects here that we do at the university. We're looking at the post-Soviet, post-2000 targeted killing program that has been renewed by Putin's regime as a policy signaling tool. So my question to you personally is, those incidents have taken toll in you personally, in your family. What do you think? Do those attempts at those targeted killings serve as a strong deterrent to you and people like you?
Well, in my case, obviously, the answer is no, because I continue to do what I do. And certainly in the case of Alexei Navalny, the answer is no. He was targeted by the same FSB poisoners as I was. He's back in Russia. He knew he was going to be arrested because the Kremlin said as much, but he also knows, as I do, and as our colleagues do, that if you're a Russian politician, you have to be in Russia. It doesn't work any other way. So obviously, it didn't work as a deterrent in our case. It probably doesn't in some others. In fact, that's the intended effect. That it's not just because they're not even hiding. Right? They're not even hiding the fact that the state is behind it.
Yeah.
Well,
we call plausible deniability sometimes is really tough.
Right, and this is so plausible deniabilities when we're talking about poisons, but when we talk about, for example, the way Boris Nemtsov was assassinated, he was murdered by a serving officer of the Interior Ministry of the Russian Federation. This is not an opinion, this is an official verdict in the Russian court. Because there was so much outcry, public outcry, both domestically in Russia and internationally when Boris Nemtsov was killed, that the authorities felt they had to do something, so they arrested and imprisoned the lowest level of the perpetrators. Of course, then completely shutting off every single avenue leading up to the organizers and certainly the mastermind in the Kremlin. But it's so transparent that everybody knows this, and they're not even trying to hide it.
Is it sanctioned from the top?
Of course it is, and we even know, thanks to very comprehensive, very thorough, very important work conducted by the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which both the US and Russia are part of. It's the world's largest security-oriented regional organization, 57 member states, from Vancouver to Vladivostok. There was an oversight report into the Nemtsov assassination. It was published 2 years ago in 2020. If you Google OSCE Nemtsov report, that's the first thing that comes up. It was conducted by Margareta Sederfeld, who's actually currently the president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. She's from Sweden. And in that report, you will find witness testimony, obviously completely ignored by Russian investigators, pointing to the entire chain of command, all the way up to Vladimir Putin personally, including the circumstances of when, where, and how he gave the order for that assassination. Everything is out in public, they're not hiding it. And so, yes, one of the intended effects, apart from silencing, in Boris Nemtsov's case, the most prominent, the most powerful, the most effective voice in opposition to Putin's regime, is also to send that message to so many other people that if you behave like these people, this is what's going to happen. But I have to say, and this is, again, to put my historian hat on, my political hat, one of the most amazing features of Russia, the modern Russia certainly, is that in any historical period, however difficult, however challenging, however impossible it seems to stand up to these dictatorships, you always find people in Russia, who are willing to go out and do this. It could be 7 people, like in August 1968, the people who demonstrated on Red Square against the invasion of Czechoslovakia, or it could be tens of thousands of people, as we saw last year in the winter of 2021 in these nationwide protests all over the country. But you always find people in Russia who are willing to do this. And what's really important is that if you look at those protests last year, the vast majority of those protesters were young people below the age of 25. Mr. Putin's turning 70 this year. He's not the future of Russia. They are.
Thank you very much. Thank you, because I didn't spare anything and didn't know what I'm doing.
That's how a real conversation should work. So thank you so much for that.
You're welcome. And I know that one of the things that I was asking is controversial, but let's open this conversation to the participants, which I hope have a lot of interesting questions that you can address. Let's start with the lady over there. It's possible,
I think I can speak loudly enough. I don't know if
I think it's for the.
I think it's for the recording. I can hear you perfectly fine. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really very informative. My question is, I don't know if you had an opportunity to see the statement made by Soviet retired General Leonid Ivashov.
Of course, a couple of days ago. Yeah.
Yes, and also his interview with Echo Moskvy was most recently, in which, as you know, but just to briefly inform the audience, it was an extraordinary statement. He is, by the way, the chairman of the retired Soviet officer corps. Russian corps,
Both actually.
Soviet
Both, yeah.
Soviet officers, but in any event, Russian, obviously now. In any event, it was a very bold statement in which he outlined all of the mistakes in his view that Putin has made. The fact that he is in calling for war, threatening for war, is really going to ruin the country. It will be degraded, and called, most interestingly, very boldly also, for his resignation. And my question is, do you see this as having any effect? I mean, on social media and elsewhere, I guess people are commenting that it is rather extraordinary that this has not been taken off the internet for the past 9 days. And I just wanted to know what you think could result from this, if anything? Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very important question. And I would add that General Ivashov was not just Soviet, but also a Russian general in the 90s. He was, in fact, for many years, he headed the International Military Cooperation Department of the Russian Ministry of Defense. And in a famous episode of the during the Kosovo War in 1999, he was one of the people responsible for the taking of Pristina Airport and so on. First of all, sort of as an aside, the last part of your comment about the internet, of course, that's the one big difference between Russia and other dictatorships like China. Say our internet is still largely free. The authorities are trying to change that. Increasingly, they're trying to block opposition websites, the websites of quote-unquote undesirable organizations, and so on. Frankly, they're making a really poor job of it. And, even someone who's as technically incompetent as I am. My kids always shame me to how much better they are using my phone than I am. But even in Moscow, it takes me maybe 5 minutes to open any of the quote-unquote block opposition websites. It's pitiful the way they do it. Thank God for that. So that's sort of on the internet side. And certainly, Ivashov's statement has been also publicized by major media outlets like Echo of Moscow, because so it's probably the main audience that it received. To me, the most important angle to the story is that this opposition to Putin, and not just any opposition, but opposition against his warmongering, is actually spreading beyond what we would consider sort of the usual suspect circles, right? There's not only people like myself or Lev Schlosser or other people who are sort of from the pro-democracy side of Russian politics. We would usually be speaking out against these sort of foreign military adventures. When you have a group that represents the top brass of the retired Soviet and Russian military, well, that sort of puts things in a different light. By the way, a senior retired FSB general, which is Vladimir also came out in support of the statement. So I think it's indicative of actually something that we were discussing with Kirill a few moments ago, as to how much this growing opposition to Putin is spreading beyond the traditional circles, not just in geographic terms, as Professor Abrams was saying, beyond sort of Moscow and Petersburg to the regions, but also politically, beyond the sort of liberal pro-democracy circles, to the quarters that you would normally not expect to hear something like this from, like the Sarmi group. And I think, frankly, that's a really bad warning sign from Mr. Putin. And I think there'll be many more to come, signs such as this in the coming months.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking that.
I saw hands going over there. Please introduce yourself.
How are you doing, Vladimir? My name is Robert Allen. I'm a first year MGPS student here. And I just want to say thank you for flying out to Austin, and hope you've enjoyed it so far. You mentioned Alexei Navalny's comment, he wants Russia to be a normal European country. However, as someone who has lived in Moldova, served in the Peace Corps there, is that necessarily a good thing? Will that transformation cause Russians to lose their own culture and their own uniqueness? I'm an advocate for democracy and freedom. However, culturally, that phrase worries me much like it does for China and the Middle East.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's a fundamental question. It will be subject of a whole seminar of its own. And of course, there's been this debate between Slavophiles and Westernizers in Russia going back to at least the early 19th century. And this, of course, continues very much today. Of course, you will be surprised to hear that I belong to the Westernizer camp in a sense, as Alexei and many of the people in Russian opposition. But what's important to say is that, and I'm grateful that you raised this point, is that Russia's identity as a European country does nothing to take away from Russia's own cultural, historic, and national roots. I mean, the European Union today includes countries as diverse as Portugal, Ireland, Finland, Italy, Germany. I mean, did they stop being Portugal, Ireland, Finland, Italy, Germany? Did they lose their national identity, their language, their culture, their religion? No, of course they did. And to me, the whole concept of European integration is that actually in this concert of nations, each nation can keep their national identity, and in fact, even better preserve very often when you put on their own, but also being part of something greater and something also that is the defining feature of all of their different cultural identities. Because as different as these countries are, they're all, at their essence, part of one great European civilization. Russia is as well, for centuries. We cannot imagine European culture, music, art, literature, without the Russian component. This just wouldn't be imagined. Certainly, if you take the last 200 or 300 years. Vladimir Solovyov, the great, not the Kremlin propagandist, but the great 19th century writer and philosopher, once wrote, to me this is the best way of sort of succinctly summarizing this whole argument. He once wrote that the word Russian is an adjective, and the correct noun is European. We are Russian European, just as there are English Europeans, French Europeans, German Europeans, and so on. And this is something Putin is trying to deny. And the whole essence of Putin's policy, also of their rhetoric, of their propaganda, is that Russia somehow is not a European country, which goes against centuries of history, of culture, of everything that we know. They're not going to succeed. I am absolutely confident. And when Navalny says this phrase, there's so many things that is encompassed by that one short phrase. And that, by the way, that's been very often the theme of what Russian opposition leaders have spoken about. Boris Nemtsov, in one of his last interviews, was asked sort of to define, to go through the major differences between the Putin regime and the Russian opposition. And again, I guess the journalist maybe was expecting a long and drawn-out response. And Boris responded with one very short phrase. He said, "We believe that Russia is a European country. They don't. They live in Ukraine." And again, there's so much encompassed in that short phrase. And so, no, I don't see any contradiction at all between preserving and praising and being proud of our heritage and culture and history, and at the same time rejoining the European family is global right to do.
Thank you, Vladimir. Additional questions? Yes, ma'am?
Thank you for being here. I lived in Moscow in 1996, and at that time, many people were very unhappy with the living situation. There was kind of informally, people said it was run by criminals and prostitutes. And there was I met a lot of people who just didn't want what they had then. So I'm wondering if you have a lot of people right now who don't want what they have now, but the primary sources of news media are still controlled. Is this being set up for another strongman?
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a fundamental question. Usually, and for those of us who are also students of modern Russian history, we know the way the pendulum swings is always to the other side. And so, almost inevitably, this is not to say that we should just lay our hands and do nothing. Not at all. That's not what I'm saying. But just sort of looking at a big historical picture, almost inevitably, what comes after Putin will swing the opposite side towards more openness, more democracy, and more sort of modern type of political system. Because, given the constraints of our time, the 21st century, Putin's regime is as authoritarian as you can get. It's a regime that murders, it's a regime that imprisons, it's a regime that does everything that we've been discussing for the past hour or so. And there are only two classical dictatorships left in Europe today on the map of Europe: Putin's Russia and Lukashenko's Belarus. And we have seen, even when change comes from within regimes, like Khrushchev after Stalin, or Gorbachev after Chernenko, and so on, even within those systems, the pendulum swings the other way. And so it is almost inevitable that whatever in the world that comes after Putin will swing that other direction. But that's, of course, absolutely not to say that we should just sit idly by and watch this happen. Because of course there are many factors in play always, and I think one of the most important tasks for us in the Russian opposition movement is to try to prepare, to lay the groundwork for that future change that's going to come after Putin, because we know from our recent history that major political changes in Russia usually happen like this, suddenly and unexpectedly. This is the way it came in 1905, in 1917, in 1991. Both the Romanov Empire and the Soviet Union collapsed in 3 days. 3 days, literally, not a figure of speech. This is how things usually happen in Russia. The problem with it happening so sort of abruptly is that nobody's prepared, or at least most people are not prepared for that change. And many of the mistakes, I believe, that were made by the democratic government in Russia in the 1990s, referring to the difficulties that came. Of course, a lot of that was to do with the legacy of 7 decades of totalitarian rule, obviously, needless to say. But also a lot of the mistakes that were made not through bad intentions or malice, but I think just because people. And so I think one of the most important tasks that we face today is to lay the groundwork for that future change. And we try to do this as much as we can by working with the young generation, sort of the new rising generation of civil society leaders and opposition leaders, and especially in the regions. We try to do this by working with municipal lawmakers, which is the last level of sort of elections in Russia. Sometimes it's still possible to get some real competition, and we have hundreds of incumbent elected pro-democracy opposition municipal lawmakers in Russia. In fact, almost a year ago, in March of 2021, we tried to convene a national conference of opposition municipal lawmakers in Moscow. We were all arrested within 10 minutes, the entire room, actually a room such as this, 200, 300 people. The police walked in, 80 fully armed police officers, and everybody was shoveled into paddy wagons and driven to police stations, because the regime understands that this does not work as well, very clearly. And so this is our major task, I think. We're counting down to that time of change, which none of us will know when it's going to happen, right? We know that it will. We know how these regimes end. We just don't know exactly when. And so to make sure, so I think the pendulum swings that way anyway, but just to make sure, to answer your question, I think it's important for us to really work to seize that next window of opportunity and to ensure that whatever comes after Putin is a more sustainable democracy than the brief window we had in the 1990s.
Thank you very much, Vladimir, for taking this question. I believe we do have, time for one last. I know that it's probably tiring for you, but I think
we enjoyed the conversation. So
thank you. This is the last one. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. Thank you for also touching upon the generation gap and the role that youth right now have in laying the groundwork. As someone who curates cultural exchange projects and works with young musicians, I was wondering, is there anything that you would recommend for a way that we can support those who might be dissidents, maybe closet dissidents in exchanges?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. Actually, that's a fitting way to conclude our conversation, because we spoke previously about the need for targeted sanctions against the Putin oligarchs and the kleptocrats and so on. We also spoke at the very beginning, and Professor Rama, in fact, opened with this, that Russia and the Putin regime are not one and the same. So conversely, as we urge Western democracies to be sort of more principled in keeping out those kleptocrats and this foreign corrupt influence coming from Putin, I think it's really important at the same time to develop and expand as much as possible people-to-people contacts between the Western Russian society and Russian citizens. Because nothing, I think, counteracts propaganda and the lies spread by propaganda as effectively as is actually seeing the truth. And I think one of the actually biggest impediments to this is the fact how difficult it is, for example, to people in Russia to go and visit the US or to a lesser extent Western European countries. And I'm not even talking now about the COVID restrictions. I mean, hopefully this is, well, not hopefully, definitely temporary, this will all disappear at some point. But even in normal, quote unquote, times, it's basically impossible for a Russian citizen to get an American visa in Russia. It literally is impossible, full stop. And I remember before your election in 2020, Victoria Nuland, who's now a senior State Department official, which is the Secretary of State, number 3 position in the State Department, she wrote a big piece in foreign policy, talking about sort of the various aspects of Russian policy. Among those aspects, she mentioned the need to expand those people-to-people contact, and she suggested what I think is a brilliant idea, to move towards visa-free or visa waiver for young Russians and young Russian activists and cultural activists and students, exactly what we're talking about. And that was an amazing idea. But I think, for now, let's just have the first step and actually make it possible to even get a visa. Get a visa waiver. You can't even get a visa if you want to. And so I think it's really important to balance those two things. And as we urge Western democracies to be more strict and more principled with regard to the Putin oligarchy, I think it's also really important for the same Western democracies to expand the cooperation with people-to-people contacts, the exchanges, the connections to Russian civil society, to Russian cultural media, because at the end of the day, this is what will help prepare us all for that future post-Putin Russia. I was just talking a minute ago in response to your question about what we do domestically to try to prepare. I think there's a really important international component to this, because the day will come when this new Cold War is over as well, just as the last one was over 3 decades ago. And the day will come when we will face the task, not just we in Russia, but also you in the West, of trying to rebuild that relationship. And nothing can prepare us for that better than cultivating and expanding and developing those people-to-people contacts now. So thank you very much for being engaged in that. Thank you for asking the question. I think that is a very strong message that we can have that conversation.
Thank you very much. I think that this was a wonderful end of our conversation, and we will have chances, for you to take probably more questions
Sure, I'm
outside
not
of
running
this.
anywhere, so-
But let's go ahead and do it. Vladimir, thank you.
Thank you so much.